Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. The Cold War is one of these events that many of us have a common picture of. It sprung up after World War II in response to Soviet aggression. It was waged through proxy wars, including those in Vietnam and Korea. It culminated under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, whose policies of peace through strength led to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. In this episode of Horns, Professor Sarah Paine of the United States Naval War College takes issue with this fairly simplistic approach and examines a variety of explanations for why the Cold War ended, why it did, when it did, and how it did. At the end of the day, Paine doesn't arrive at a single answer, but paints a much richer portrait of the fascinating events that led to a substantial shift in world organization. Let's listen in.
Well, thank you for having me. It is such a treat, although it's this disembodied world of the internet. It's my obligation to read you this disclaimer. This presentation represents my opinions, not necessarily those of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or the Naval War College. So we good? It's written there. My purpose today is twofold. I'm going to give the promised talk about why Russia lost the Cold War, but I also thought you would be a little interested about what we teach at the Strategy and Policy Department at the Naval War College to junior and senior officers. And one of the most valuable parts of the curriculum for them, and I think it would be valuable for you, is emphasizing the importance of a counter-argument. So you write a paper or you have your own opinion, that's your thesis, but what would your most persuasive critics say? And then really investigate the thoughts of your critic. What evidence do they use, et cetera? And then eventually you would rebut that counter argument, or maybe you change your mind and decide that counter argument is actually correct. So today is going to be a tour of the counter arguments. If one were posed the question, why did Russia lose the Cold War? Some very popular thesis answering this question would be, hey, it's Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. A lot of people believe that. And that would be an external explanation, what other people did to the Soviet Union. And there are also internal explanations, what the Russians did to themselves. And then you can make some overarching explanations. So that's my basic game plan. But I'll start with the basic one, which is, okay, why did it turn out the way it did? Some people would say, hey, it's Ronald Reagan. He won that thing. And here's this nice picture of the Reagans and the Gorbachevs. They're at the Reagan Ranch after the Cold War is all over, and it looks pretty cordial for that kind of an explanation. Well, Ronald Reagan was a man of words and deeds. He made really memorable speeches. And here he is in front of Parliament in 1982. And he said, look, the regimes planted by totalitarianism have had more than 30 years to establish their legitimacy, but none, not one, has yet been able to risk free elections. Regimes planted by bayonets do not take root. And here he is in Berlin. He is giving a talk before the Brandenburg Gate, long a symbol of German greatness, but at the time a locked gate, Berlin Wall. And he said, look, Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you want prosperity, you want liberalization, come to this gate, tear down this wall. And then who can forget the evil empire speech that he gave in Orlando, Florida, to the National Association of Evangelical Christians, who gave up a day in Disneyland to hear it. But Ronald Reagan was not only a man of words, but he's a man of deeds. He continued President Carter's military buildup that had been started in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. He engaged in a really aggressive program of maritime and aerial patrolling. He set up his strategic defense initiative, his missile defense, and he had what was called the Reagan Doctrine. It was a really aggressive program to roll back communism by funding anti-communist insurgencies wherever he could find them. It was his version of NSC 68. At the time, CIA and other intelligence organizations estimated that the Soviet Union probably spent about 20% of its budget on the military. After the Cold War was over, they did a major reassessment and said, whoops, turns out they were actually spending 40 or 50%. And if you included the entire military industrial complex, infrastructure, the works, you wound up with a number that's closer to 70 or 75%. It is an economy wrecking percentage. For comparison, I've given you figures for the United States, less than 8%, Even Nazi Germany, it's 55%. So the Soviet Union, for a Cold War, they're spending an awful lot of money on the military. I am going to be quoting many Russians today. And the reason why is they've thought deeply about why their country lost the Cold War, the empire, and indeed life as they knew it. And here is Valentin Falin. He was the Soviet ambassador to Germany, and here's his take. Following the American strategy of our exhaustion in the arms race, we cut back on all kinds of social spending. And our crisis in public health, educational matters, everything having to do with quality of life reached a new dimension. And given that at the time the Soviet Union had really tense relations with China, they'd had major border clashes, almost went to a full-scale war. The arms race plunged the Soviet economy into a permanent crisis. And here's Georgy Arbatov. He was the Soviets' top expert in the United States, and he looked at Ronald Reagan's funding of the anti-Soviet insurgents in Afghanistan, and he said, but it is quite clear that the Afghan war was most advantageous for the United States. And we got our Vietnam, and we began to understand this. And here's Gorbachev a year and change after he took office, telling the Politburo, look, maybe we should just stop being afraid of this strategic defense initiative. The Americans are betting precisely on the fact that the Soviet Union's afraid of it. That's why they're putting pressure on us to exhaust us. Correct. So some would argue that the U.S. victory in the Cold War was all about Ronald Reagan and the arms race. And that's the thing that guaranteed victory in the Cold War. Okay, that's a thesis. Now I'm going to give you all kinds of counter arguments and a variety of external explanations. I'm going to start with Presidents Ford and Carter. Ford signed the Helsinki Accords about human rights, and then President Carter took that human rights campaign and ran with it. For a long, long time, the Soviet Union had really wanted to hold a conference with all of the Western Europeans in the United States in order to confirm the Soviet Union's expanded boundaries that they had expanded as a result of World War II. And for a long time, the West was just plain not interested. And eventually, the Western Europeans were sick of the drama, and they wanted to hold a conference. The United States still dragged its feet, but then we went along with it. We then insisted that there be some mention about human rights. We didn't think it was actually that important, but if we were going to be there, we're going to make the Soviets sign stuff about the human rights. But we didn't think that anything would come of it, because why would they enforce it? Well, unbeknownst to the United States, human rights activists in the West and dissidents in the Eastern Bloc started holding their governments accountable and saying, what's going on here? What is this disconnect between the liberation promised by communism and the dictatorship actually delivered? You signed the Helsinki Accords. What's going on here? And this dissident movement took on a life of its own. And here's Robert Gates. He was a longtime employee of the CIA, eventually rose to be its director, and after that, the head of the Department of Defense. And here's his take, because he was there during all of this. He said, look, the Soviets desperately wanted this big meeting, and it laid the foundations for the end of their empire. We resisted it for years, only to discover much later that it had yielded benefits beyond our wildest imagination. Go figure. So some would argue that Jimmy Carter's human rights campaign was effective. It resonated most deeply among the very people who were denied these rights in Eastern Europe. And here he is at the University of Notre Dame giving an address, and he said, look, we have reaffirmed America's commitment to human rights as a fundamental tenet of our foreign policy. What draws Americans together is a belief in human freedom. We want the world to know that our nation stands for more than just financial prosperity. We are bigger than that. Gorbachev's English language translator, Pavel Pelagenka, said that Carter's human rights campaign was really important because it set people thinking in the Russian government and their elites going, we need to be more democratic. We need to be more open and starting to respect civil liberties. It will make our society better. And here's Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze telling Communist Party members of the Foreign Ministry in 1990, the belief that we are a great country is deeply ingrained in me. But great in what? Territory, population, arms, problems? In what do we, who have virtually the highest infant mortality rate on the planet, take pride? It is not easy answering the questions, who are you and who do you wish to be? A country which is feared or a country which is respected? A country of power or a country of kindness? And others agreed. Vitaly Ignatyenko, who's a Russian journalist, he covered the rise of Gorbachev to power and then the fall of the Berlin Wall. He said, look, the Soviet Union just couldn't survive on a base, a foundation of this undemocratic ideology. And Oleg Grinievsky, a Soviet career diplomat, agrees. He said, look, communist ideology is associated above all with the Soviet Union. When Gorbachev dumps that, there's this vacuum. And also communism depends upon a big enemy. That's how you justify all the deprivations in the militarized state. But Germany was now a friend, and so was the United States. And this would be communist China's problem today. It needs the big enemy. And then you have Boris Yeltsin, who is Gorbachev's successor, going, hey, no one wants a new Soviet Union. So you can make an argument. The end of the Cold War really has very little to do with Ronald Reagan. It's really all about the human rights causes of the Helsinki Accords and Carter's subsequent human rights campaign that destroyed the communist belief in communism. Okay, another president, another counter-argument. You can make a completely different line of reasoning and say, no, it's all about Nixon. Nixon plays the China card, and then China and the United States gang up on the Soviet Union to overextend it. Others would say, no, you got that one backwards. It would be Mao playing the America card, however you want to look at it. In 1969, the Soviet Union and China had a nasty border conflict, and it almost escalated in a really big way. In the middle of it, the Soviets came to the US government and said, hey, would it be okay if we nuked the Chinese? And the United States said, no way, it would not be okay if you nuked them. And the Chinese got it. The one that wants to nuke you, that would be the primary adversary. And great minds think alike. And before long, you have Henry Kissinger off to Beijing on his secret trip, lining up the very public opening to China when Nixon's in China in 1972. And that turns out to be a very expensive proposition for the Soviet Union because they militarized their very long border with China. They'd already militarized the border with Eastern Europe, et cetera, but now they're doing it with this border with China. This is mechanized forces, nuclear weapons, et cetera, extraordinarily expensive. Imagine how economy busting it would be if the United States had to have those kinds of forces all along our Canadian and Mexican borders. And the Soviet economy, it was but a fraction of ours. It was a mess. So others would make this different argument and say, look, it was US cooperation with China that fatally overextended the Soviet Union and wrecked it. Others would like to take all of this and glue it together and say Presidents Nixon through Reagan opened opportunities for their successors so that you start with Nixon. He plays the China card that his successors play with ever greater dexterity. And then you have Ford, who signs the Helsinki Accords. They're going to play the human rights card. Carter's going to continue with that, and he starts a buildup when Ronald Reagan finishes. And that positions Reagan to negotiate with the Soviet Union from a position of ideological and military strength. For those of you who believe that U.S. foreign policy is totally erratic, at a macro level, it's relentless. For years, both parties have based it on some flavor of free trade, democracy, and the containment of communism. And they've had different ideas of strategies to get there, but these things have been persistent themes in U.S. foreign policy. So you could make quite a credible argument, say that Presidents Nixon through Reagan produced cumulative presidential effects that defeated the Soviet Union. Others would argue, no, it's not about presidents at all. It's about military platforms. This is platforms Pentagonese. And here's a platform. It's a nuclear submarine. And these people would say it was all about nuclear subs and the nuclear weapons on them, that these subs put at risk Soviet second strike capability. So they were unclear if they were attacked by nuclear weapons, whether they would have an ability to launch a counterattack. And if they couldn't do that, they couldn't deter the first strike. So they were on a very dangerous first strike posture that scared them. Should have scared us too if we'd known more about it. And you can look at them assessing us, and here's a longtime aide to Gorbachev, Valery Boldin, saying, look, the United States' most important strength is the Navy. And because of geography and finance, Russia was not going to get a Navy like that one. And Marshal Yazov agrees. He said, for the United States, the main means for atomic attack was indeed the fleet. And here's Marshal Sergei Akhrameyev, who would commit suicide upon the disintegration of the Soviet Union. He was in the United States in 1987, and he told his hosts, we're surrounded. And that's why we're concerned. We know, you know where our submarines are, but we don't know where yours are. And that's destabilizing. The United States Navy, are the problem. Go Navy. His host, Admiral Trost, reflected upon this visit later, and he said, the inability of the Soviet Union to maintain a strong defensive capability, given their economy, led to the demise of the Soviet Union and to the removal of the Soviets as a major threat to our capabilities or interests. So you can make an argument that the Soviet Union could not counter technologically or financially the U.S. submarine threat to its retaliatory nuclear forces, so war termination was the only solution left for them. All right, so I've given you a whole raft of explanations, and they're all naval explanations. Naval spelt with an E, as in staring at one's own. But at the education we offer at the Naval War College, we encourage students, you've got to get across the tennis court net and look at the other team and see what their interests, motivations are, think about your interaction of them. And one of the key theorists that we use is Clausewitz. And Clausewitz, again, emphasizes warfare is interaction. You have got to get a grasp on the other side and what they're thinking and doing and what their values are. And here I have pictured for you Arnold Toynbee. He's one of the great historians of the 20th century. And he observed that civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. So the external explanations are all the murders, what other countries did to the Soviet Union. But the suicide is what the Soviets did to themselves. And now I'm going to turn to these internal explanations. Internal explanation number one is the Soviet Union collapsed because the empire collapsed. That empire, the collapse of that empire was a cause, not an effect of why they lost the Cold War. You all know about the domino theory, right? That was very popular during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The idea is if the United States wasn't vigilant, that a capitalist country after another would fall like dominoes to communism. Well, it turns out they got it backwards. Between 1988 and 89, there was a domino effect, and it was of all the communist countries that fell from communism to capitalism. So they got that one wrong. What was odd about the Soviet Union is normally when you think about communist theory or imperialist practice, the mother country is actually more economically developed than the colonies. Well, the reverse was actually the case in the Soviet Union. The places that occupied in Eastern Europe were richer, more educated, et cetera. So when they imploded, so did all the economic goodies that they had been depending on other people. So the theory needed some adjustment. So what happened actually in the day is when demonstrations first began in the Soviet Union for more democratic freedoms and also for a better performing economy. So these things spread to Eastern Europe. So the demonstrations in the Soviet Union are for political freedom, and the ones in the Eastern Bloc are for freedom from the Soviet Union, because these ideas of glasnost, which is Gorbachev's expression of openness, and perestroika, rebuilding, resonated. And as one country had demonstrations, there was this domino effect throughout all of them. And the crisis really began in Poland. Poland had long been a center of unrest. There had been big worker strikes in 56, 1970, 76, 80, and 81. In the 80-81 period, the Solidarity Workers movement gained an international and national reputation. It was the only independent opposition group in any of the Eastern Bloc countries. And things got really bad in 1988. Between 1980 and 87, the Polish standard of living fell by over 3%. And the government was really desperate. In February 88, they raised food prices because their budget deficit is so horrendous. And the workers just hit the streets. And the Communist Party was so scared that this was going to further cripple an already crippled economy. So they reached out to Solidarity and said, hey, if you stop the strikes, we'll give you a place at the bargaining table. And Solidarity took them up on that. There was a complicating factor in Poland, which was the Polish Pope. The Roman Catholic Church has enormous legitimacy as an institution in Poland. And also it had a partiality for Solidarity, and it was going to help Solidarity organize. So here are the roundtable talks that were called a year later in February 1989, where the Solidarity got together with the Communist Party, deciding what to do. And the Russians, one of the Russian representatives gave a little advice to one of the Poles. He said, look, you're a small country. When you make mistakes, they're going to be itty bitty mistakes. And you got to go first, because if we make mistakes, they're going to be really big. Got that one right. They decided that they were going to hold elections in June. And the election day corresponded with the day that Deng Xiaoping sent the tanks in Tiananmen. In Tiananmen, the communists just killed off the opposition in China, and the Communist Party has survived this day. But the Communist Party in Poland figured that they really controlled these electoral laws and it would be fine. Not so much. And this is how it worked. Solidarity won every single seat but one for which it could compete. And then it organized people for the party designated seats to vote in the following way. The party won exactly 3 of those seats. And every other single one of those seats was won by the box called none of the above. And the Communist Party lost its legitimacy that day. And free elections were going to be the next thing that came down the road in Poland. 4 months later in East Germany, around the 40th anniversary of East Germany as a country, demonstrations broke out all over East Germany, so that in this 1 week period at the end of October and the beginning of November, you have over 1 million East Germans hitting the streets in 210 different places. This is a picture, I think it's Leipzig, where there were 70,000 demonstrators. In the past, the East Germans had always sent tanks. And if you send tanks against demonstrators, it doesn't last long. It's really bloody and awful, and then it is over. But this guy, would-be tank man, he had already been booted in mid-October because of his ruinous strategy of living off debt that had tanked the economy and led to the demonstrations. But things weren't getting any better. The demonstrations kept coming. The Council of Ministers resigns on November 7th, followed by the Politburo, and then what's left of this government issues new travel rules. Except they don't say when the rules are going to be implemented or who is going to be in charge of all of that. Enter fog, friction, and chance. So this guy, Gunter Schabowski, was a big cheese in the East German Communist Party. He goes into a press conference, and instead of admitting he doesn't know the answer to a question, he wings it. They ask him, hey, when are the travel regulations going into effect? He goes, immediately. Well, crowds then start massing at the 6 gates in East Berlin that would release them into West Berlin. And the border guards at one of these gates decides that discretion is the better part of valor, and they open the gate. And people flood into West Berlin. And a pivotal choice has been made, like the elections in Poland. Once you make a pivotal choice, there is no going back to the way it was. Within the week, over 9 million East Germans visited the West. That's over half the population. Within the month, 1% of them of the country decided to emigrate permanently and were just plain out of Dodge. And here you have Gunter Schabowski reflecting on it afterwards. He goes, we hadn't a clue that opening the wall was the beginning of the end of East Germany. Don't have a clue. Really? This is your excuse and your country goes down. What a guy. And the Russians were shocked at the reactions of Eastern Europeans to communism and to what they chose to do next. And here you have a parliamentarian and scientist with a sense of humor, Yuri Ryzhov, who says, look, all of our former satellites by compulsion cast off from us as fast and far as possible. Anatoly Kovalyov, the deputy foreign minister, said, look, there was no confidence whatsoever concerning whom the East German army would shoot, us or the demonstrators. And the same story for the Polish and Hungarian armies. Great. With allies like these, who needs any enemies? So you could argue that unrest within the empire forced the Soviet Union to forfeit the Cold War. All right, another explanation. No. There never would have been this disintegration if the satellites had been healthy. That was the problem. And if you look at this map, which is around 1960, and all those tempting green places, they're about to become independent. And they are really sick of the Western colonial powers. Enter the Soviet Union with a plan to put the West out of business. And there were many takers. Fast forward to the 1980s, and look at all those promising red places. Ooh. And here's the hitch. Those fun allies got more and more expensive to have. Why? Because commodity prices tanked in the late 70s onwards. And these were the exports of those newfound friends. And places like Angola, Somalia, South Yemen, Nicaragua should sound familiar. These places are still a mess. They never got over their dalliance with communism. Their export earnings plummeted. It meant their standard of living was going down. It meant they needed more aid from the Soviet Union, which was suffering from problems of its own, because included among those commodities was oil. Oil prices were going down. Well, that's what the Soviet Union was using for its, to pay for its non-performing pals. And they had become awfully expensive. And then it got worse because the Soviet Union's own nationalities started erupting and complaining about living conditions. And the problem is everybody's erupting all at the same time. There isn't enough Red Army to put in these places simultaneously. Here's a nationalities map. The unrest of the nationalities in the Soviet Union started in 1985, 86 in Yakutia and Kazakhstan. By the time you get to the 1990, they're like 70 plus places in open revolt. There are just too many places to tend to all at once. So you can make an argument that wouldn't be too bad, saying, look, the Soviet Union bankrupts itself in the third world while ignoring its own internal third world of nationalities whose simultaneous revolts brought down the empire. And that was it for the Cold War. Another counterargument for you, is it's none of the above. The real story is the Soviet economy. That economy lost the soul, the Cold War. It just could not perform. And that was the problem. Here's some nice economic data. You can see that the Soviet economy performed pretty well through the 1950s when they're rebuilding after World War II, but it gets really ugly from the 1970s onward. So that when you get to when Gorbachev takes power, the Soviet Union had been growing at a rate 1 to 2% less than the United States for the preceding decade. And if you compound all of that, it gets to be really, really ugly. And here is another problem showing about the tanking economy. No one in the Soviet Union actually knew what is the real value of labor. What is the real value? What are the real values of all the different commodities, all the inputs? What is the productivity of labor? What do consumers actually want? And at the base of this problem is every subunit is lying to the other about what its inventories are because they're afraid they aren't going to be able to get inventories. So everyone's running around with atrocious macroeconomic data and making decisions on the basis of this, so that no one knows they're just grossly misallocating labor and capital until this whole thing is metastasized into a crisis. And you can see here the Soviet economy goes into falls off a cliff in 1985, and it does not bottom out until 1998. And here are the big stats. Trade deficits are just getting huge, budget deficit, internal debt. It's all ugly. Look at double-digit negative growth. How did you do it? A total mess. In fact, it was so bad, you have Marshal Yazov going, look, we simply lack the power to oppose NATO, all these places with flourishing economies. We had to find an alternative to the arms race. So you could argue, as Anatoly Adamyshin, a foreign service officer, he says, look, our problems began with our abandonment of autarky. And our main reasons of our demise have to do with these internal reasons. And because our economy is not doing well, we get exhausted from this arms race, militarism, enemies with half the world. It wasn't working for us. And within a year of taking power, Gorbachev agrees. He said, look, we're encircled not by invincible armies, but by superior economies. And he would repeatedly tell people living this way any longer is impossible. So you could make quite a powerful argument to say, hey, it was the Soviet economy that lost the Cold War. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a really profound book about France, about the final years of the monarchy before it fell to the French Revolution. And he observed that the most dangerous moment for a bad government is when it begins to reform. And Russians of all political persuasions, there's one thing they agree on, which is that Gorbachev played a really pivotal role in what happened with all of these events. And it turns out that Gorbachev made certain incorrect assumptions. And his first assumption was the irreversible direction of history, always forward towards communism, never backwards to capitalism. It never occurred to him that people could just take a U-turn and say capitalism is going to be it for us. And of course, that is precisely what Eastern Europe did. He made another false assumption, and it had to do with the sentiments of the neighbors, the Eastern Europeans. For Gorbachev, the clock began when he took power and really made enormous efforts to liberalize. And he believed the Eastern Europeans would truly appreciate this. But for Eastern Europeans, the clock had begun a lot earlier under Stalin, who had occupied their countries and shot their leaders. So here you have Anatoly Chernayev, a foreign policy advisor to Gorbachev, saying, look, Gorbachev thought that bringing freedom to our Eastern European satellites would lead them to adopt socialism with a human face. He made an enormous mistake because these countries brutally turned their back on us. Okay, if this is brutal, what, pray tell, was Stalin? And Chernayev continued, the politics in connection with our former friends were totally unexpected for us. Really? You invade their country, you shoot their leadership, you impose a government, you siphon off their resources, and you never leave, and you wonder why they don't like you? The United States intervenes in people's civil wars all over the world. We spend billions of dollars in economic aid. We even leave. and people don't like us. Why on earth do the Russians think they are so special? Gorbachev made a third incorrect assumption. He believed if you get rid of the Warsaw Pact and Comecon, which is the trading union of all the Eastern Bloc, that NATO is going to disappear, and so is the European Community, if that's the predecessor of the European Union. And he tells the Politburo, hey, the Americans are definitely going to dissolve NATO because there's going to be no Warsaw Pact. He doesn't get it. Organizations that are made at the end of a bayonet are very different from voluntary organizations, and they dissolve for different reasons. And then he made a third false assumption. He believed that the United States would oppose German unification. He assumed the United States would operate like a continental empire. Continental empires really hate big neighbors. They're dangerous. They can invade you. You want little neighbors. You want to carve them up. And Gorbachev believed that the United States would take this zero-sum view. And so when all the unrest erupted in East Germany, Gorbachev was off for vacation. Poor life choice. Because actually what was going on is George Bush Sr. and Helmut Kohl of West Germany were working together to figure out how to unify Germany and put it right in NATO. So many Russians who supported Gorbachev later were really angry at him. Here's Vladimir Lukin, an expert in the United States. He's looking at these things and thinking in terms of foreign policy mistakes in Russia were a function of domestic policy mistakes, and that had caused the Soviet Union to collapse. And Lukin goes, Gorbachev, he's no Deng Xiaoping. And Arbatov, the big cheese expert in the United States, was really angry. He goes, we fell apart because of the stupidity of our leaders, i.e. of Gorbachev. So it was suicide by mistake. The big bozo was playing with plastic bags. He stuck one on his head, and that was that. Lukin commented that in the West, they loved Gorbachev because everything took place so simply and easily and cheaply, basically like that. But for us, it was really expensive. I got it. But Stalinism was far more expensive. It was time to reassess. Others would make a different argument and say, look, it's not about Gorbachev's sins of commission. It's about the Red Army's sin of omission. What the Red Army should have done is exactly what Deng Xiaoping did. Send in the tanks, blow away all the demonstrators, and it'll be good. Well, Eastern European leaders did not have the stomach for that kind of bloodshed then, and they didn't do it. But there are people in the Soviet Union to this day who regard that as, or in Russia to this day, who regard that as a terrible mistake. So they would argue that timely tank deployments, officers love acronyms, so here's my contribution, TTD, would have changed the outcome of the Cold War. Send the tanks and the Soviet Union would still be with us. Others say, no, it was a sin of commission, but it wasn't Gorbachev's sin of commission. It was a sin of commission by this charmer, his successor, Boris Yeltsin, who removed Article 6 of the Constitution, which had guaranteed the Communist Party a leading role. Once you get rid of that, other parties compete. And then he sealed the deal by signing with Belarus and Ukraine the Belovyozha Accords, which dissolved the Soviet Union. In other words, it was suicide on purpose. That's why there is no Soviet Union today. It's the Belovyozha Accords. So I've given you a whole set of external explanations. I've given you internal explanations. Now for some umbrella explanations. You could make the argument, hey, any of the above, the Soviet Union was destined to fail, or you could make the opposite argument, say, no. It took all of the above. The West barely won. So I'll start with any of the above. You could make a powerful argument and say, look, there were so many things that were wrong with this place. Of course, it was only a matter of time that it was going to collapse. I mean, think about it. At the end of the day, the Soviets who invented the system didn't like it, and they wanted to get rid of it. The reasons for its collapse were the reasons why the West had despised the Soviet Union from the beginning. It was brutally inefficient. It needed to go. So it went. Okay. So here are some people who buy that line of reasoning. Here's an actual rocket scientist, Yuri Ryzhov, who said, look, the main reason for the collapse is the rottenness of the system. And here you have a journalist, Timura Stepanov, who's going, I think from the beginning, the genes of disintegration were contained in the genetics of this governmental political formation. Don't you love how the communists write? It's just, I don't know, it makes you cringe. Don't ever try this in papers and other written work. It won't go well. So you can make a great argument to say the Soviet Union was destined to lose. It had nothing to do with Ronald Reagan. It's great that all the Reaganites think he was so special. I'm so sorry. He was dealing with a dead horse. A different story altogether. There are others who make the opposite interpretation, say, it took all of the above. The West barely won the Cold War on their terms. And this is Anatoly Kovalyov's take. He said, thus all the factors merged, internal, ideological, economic, military in order to end the Cold War, to arrange for the Cold War's funeral feast. You remove any one of these things, and the Cold War does not end on Western terms. So if you buy this line of reasoning, the best barely won it, count your lucky blessings. You can make another twist on this argument to say not only did you need the confluence of all these unfortunate events, but you needed the overlap in leadership roles of these two gentlemen here, Chancellor Helmut Kohl of West Germany and George H.W. Bush Sr. of the United States. Because Helmut Kohl came up with a plan to buy up East Germany one tourist at a time. But before I get there, I'm going to give you the resumes of these two gentlemen. Bush was probably one of the most qualified people ever to occupy the presidency. Think about it. He was a very young veteran of World War II, brave man, Navy pilot. He comes home, gets his BA with honors from Yale. He goes on to start his own oil company, becomes a millionaire. Then he becomes a congressman before becoming U.S. ambassador to the UN. And then he's the representative in China who's overseeing the normalization of U.S.-Chinese relations before becoming the director of the CIA, and then vice president under Reagan for 8 years. Talk about a tremendously qualified guy. And here's his opposite number, equally qualified. Helmut Kohl was the longest serving chancellor since his very illustrious predecessor, Otto von Bismarck. He had gotten a PhD in political science and history. Like Bush, he'd gone on to be a businessman. And then he started out in state government and eventually became a governor. And then he became the chairman of his political party, the Christian Democratic Union, for 25 years. Enormously talented guy. And he's the man who's going to be purchasing the tourists. And this is how it works. Turns out East Germans love to travel. And West Germans also love to travel. They had been able to go to East Germany for a long time, but it was really hard for East Germans to travel to the West. And the reason why is because they had a habit of staying. But then the East Germans suddenly loosened the travel restrictions. And you might ask why. And the answer would be money. That East Germany was deep in an economic mess of its own making, and the West Germans were willing to pay them to let people travel. And that is precisely what happened. So here are how the deals went. The first deal is the one I just mentioned. East Germany eases travel restrictions to West Germany, and then the West Germans pay them 500 million Deutschmarks for doing the exit visas. Then Hungary opens its border to Austria to East Germans, and that means East Germans can get out of the Eastern Bloc via Austria. They get into Austria and off they go. So West Germany gives Hungary 500 million Deutschmarks to do this. And then later, Kohl has his 10-point unification program. And then he gives a big payoff to the Soviet Union in food because the social unrest is getting ugly for Gorbachev, and they're having trouble producing meat, and Germany provides this. So that's all going well, except it's not going well for Gorbachev. The unrest is seething throughout Eastern Europe and in Russia. And it's getting so bad that Kohl and Bush decide they're going to fast track unification. They make this decision around January-ish 1990. Why? Because they think Gorbachev is going to fall from power and they had better seal the deal before that happens. And there are some problems in the way of doing this. First of all, Gorbachev is dead against NATO, Germany, a unified Germany being in NATO. And U.S. State Department experts say, hey, you want to go slow on this. Just take it easy. And this gentleman here, Foreign Minister Genscher, is very skeptical about German membership in NATO. And he's an unfireable guy. Why? Because he comes from a different political party from Kohl. And Kohl needs that party on board to maintain his leadership. So Genscher is not going away. And Britain and France are very skeptical about German unification. So Kohl and Bush have a division of tasks. And here's how it works. Kohl is going to do a lot of diplomacy with Gorbachev to reassure them. And he's going to work out the financial reunification. And it's going to be unification by stealth, because the Soviets don't understand the financial instrument of economic power. If they did, their economy would never have been in such a mess. But Kohl's going to work on making the Deutschmark the currency of East Germany. And once you do that, it's going to take spending power right away from the East German government. And the Soviets are not going to understand that has happened until it has happened. To allow this to play out, Bush's job is to delay diplomacy with Western allies for as long as possible. There are a bunch of pre-scheduled meetings, big meetings with the allies, and Bush's job was to keep delaying those things as long as possible so that they could get serial concessions from Gorbachev before either France or Britain derailed them. And they played a game of tag team diplomacy that it was just too fast for Gorbachev to keep up with, given the turmoil going on in the Soviet Union. So here's how all that works. Gorbachev agrees to German unification. Now look at the numbers. They're no longer fractions of billions. They're in multiples of billions. Kohl promises him 5 billion Deutschmarks. Then Gorbachev agrees, okay, states can choose their alliances, i.e. whether or not they join NATO, to which the United States offers 9 assurances to Gorbachev, includes a trade agreement that Gorbachev really wanted. Then for some of the big stuff, July is a really busy month. The German Economic Union goes into effect. This is the unification by stealth, when you're going to have the Deutschmark throughout Germany and when the Russians truly don't understand what has just happened to them. You also have the London Declaration, which invites Eastern European countries to cooperate more closely with NATO. And then there's a big G7 summit, which agrees that they're going to fast track aid to the Soviet Union, to which Gorbachev agrees to German NATO membership. And then the really big ticket items. Germany confirms Polish borders, and I'll show you why that's so important. And it gives really big money to the Soviet Union, 15 billion Deutschmark. And it pays for new housing for repatriated Soviet soldiers. All these soldiers who are leaving Eastern Europe, they're going to go back home. You go, well, why do the Germans care about apartment buildings in Moscow and stuff? Well, it's because these soldiers, Kohl would much prefer that they're out buying furniture for the new apartments rather than plotting coups. So the apartment buildings are important. And then you get the Treaty on German Unification that's signed in September 1990. And here's the Polish borders to explain why it is so important that Germany agree to them. Stalin, at the end of World War II, he moved Poland far to the west, and not the normal thing to do to a country. And in fact, Germany is reduced by 1/3 from its pre-war size as a result of doing this. Stalin uproots 12 million Germans who'd been, a lot of them in Poland, but also elsewhere in Eastern Europe, and he sends them back to Germany. 2 million of them die on the way. And the Germans did not want to agree to this, but in return for reunification, they do. A month and a half before this unification agreement in 1990 is signed, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. And the next day, Operation Desert Shield begins. And think about this. Russian troops have not even begun to be pulled out of East Germany. the pullout is not going to be over for another 4 years. So this Cold War termination is anything but a done deal. Meanwhile, Iraq is a really important Soviet client state. The Soviets, I think, had lent them something like 10 or $13 billion. That's a lot of money for a broke creditor. And so Gorbachev is really in on it, and he sends his special envoy, Yevgeny Primakov. He's trying to get the Iraqis to get out of Kuwait. Primakov, on his first trip, he gets Saddam to release 3,000 Soviet hostages. On his next trip, he gets all the Western hostages released. And then on his third trip, he isn't so lucky that he's there for the bombing and quite unhappy about that. But imagine if during the bombing campaign, human shields, Americans, are going down with every bomb attack. Well, Gorbachev took that one right off the table. And this, how the Soviets were looking at all of this. This is Sergei Tarasenko. He's an aide to Foreign Minister Shevardnadze. And the Soviets understood the United States was going to do something about Iraq and Kuwait. The United States was simply not going to sit there. And the Soviets realized they're weak. And they decided it was in their interest, if whatever the United States was going to do, that it was vetted through the Security Council of the UN. Why? Because the Soviets have a veto. And you could make precisely the same argument to China, which is what the Russians do. According to Tarasenko, there was a division of roles, and the Americans asked us to work with the Chinese. We told them, said, hey, the Americans are going to do their thing, but wouldn't you prefer to have them send it through the Security Council where you can veto it, or exact concessions in return for not vetoing it? And they did get concessions and things that they cared about. So that's why you have no vetoing of the U.S. intervention in Kuwait. Anatoly Kovalyov had a red line, and that red line is the territorial integrity of Iraq. And so this explains why you have a 100-hour war where Bush is not going to do some march on Baghdad. He understands what the prize is. Saddam Hussein is not the prize. He's a piece of work. A victory in the Cold War is the prize. And Bush understood full well that if you mess around in Iraq, the Soviets are going to get incredibly angry, and you're going to tank Cold War termination in Europe. So they didn't do that, and that explains stuff. Well, Prime Minister Thatcher and President François Mitterrand might have been really happy if the United States had tanked certain things, because they were really, really unhappy about a unified Germany in NATO. Why? Because it relegated their countries to second-tier status. And Mitterrand eventually found solace in playing a really leading role in the European Union. That's what brought Eastern Europe and Western Europe together in the Maastricht Treaty, which he played a really fundamental role in getting that thing going so that you have an EU. Margaret Thatcher never came around. In fact, the British in general had always talked quite a good piece where they said, oh, yeah, we're for German unification. But actually they weren't. And Thatcher said, look, Germany will be the Japan of Europe, but worse than Japan. Okay, I'm guessing she hadn't been to Japan lately. And she complained that the Germans will get in peace what Hitler couldn't get in the war. So her idea is she wanted to keep Red Army troops in Germany indefinitely. Okay. Imagine dealing with Vladimir Putin today if everyone had gone along with Mitterrand and Thatcher's plans. Germany now has another really competent chancellor, Angela Merkel, who has been dealing deftly with this guy and his invasion of the Ukraine and other stuff. But amen, she has a country that is big enough to do it. George Bush was very careful not to humiliate Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War, and so was Helmut Kohl. Bush promised Kohl, he said, look, I'm not going to beat my chest and dance on the Berlin Wall. Why? Because to do so, if they'd been, oh, we got you, the Soviet Union lost this thing, that Gorbachev would have fallen from power even earlier, and probably hardliners would have risen to power even earlier. As it was, it took about 20 years before the hardliners under Vladimir Putin consolidate powers. And this 20 years was a really crucial breathing space for Eastern Europe. It gave them the time for these fledgling governments to integrate militarily, economically, and politically with the West without having Russia trying to destabilize them. And it gave the glue some time to set. So it would be no dancing on the Berlin Wall for Bush, no second term. He lost the 1992 elections. The last troops wouldn't be out of Eastern Europe until 1994. But I believe he will go down as a great president in U.S. history for his role in terminating the Cold War on Western terms. But if you're to ask, well, who really made things work out the way they did? Anatoly Adamyshin, a Soviet Foreign Service officer, said, look, it's difficult to deny that the Soviet Union was the one that ended the Cold War. And Edwin Meese, a really close advisor to President Reagan and his attorney general, agreed. He said, look, the Cold War began because of Soviet policies and it ended, in a sense, because of Soviet policies. And the Nobel Prize Committee agreed. They awarded that prize to Gorbachev, not to Bush. And I believe it was for lifting the tyranny, liberating Eastern Europe, which Gorbachev most certainly did. So as you contemplate the world and think about why did the Cold War end as it did, I hope you all will come up with a more complicated answer than Ronald Reagan did it. There are other factors that went into it. I leave it up to you to decide which ones you think are the big ones. And those are what I have for prepared marks. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.